Welcome to the 38th episode of Microsoft Art of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Millionlights is a TV channel dedicated to improving skills of people and their employability. Now, let me tell you more about Microsoft Art of Code. Microsoft Art of Code is a series of lectures, courses, and talks by experts who are going to discuss the latest Microsoft technologies, topics related to programming, and industry forecasts that are all focused on employability. Today we are going to learn Visual Studio Advanced feature. This course is basically for people pursuing computer science. These episodes have everything you need to upgrade your skill and help you to develop your own application. This content has been created by our partner Microsoft. We have Steven Borg and Rennie with us from Microsoft, who are going to talk about everything you need to know about Visual Studio. Now let's move towards the course. In the previous episode, we covered introduction, design, debug overview, and demonstration, test overview. In this episode, we will cover test demonstration, tune overview, and tune demonstration, in which we will learn application performance. Application performance is critical to the success of nearly all applications. Learn how to use web performance testing and load testing and find performance bottlenecks and identify opportunities. And release, through which we will understand how release management can dramatically simplify the creation of CI or CD pipelines that include build, unit test, package, deploy, and integration testing steps. So let's get started.
Hi, welcome back. We're jumping into the debug section of our Visual Studio Advanced Features overview. In our debug section, we're going to be talking about Intellitrace in production, code map debugging, and the .NET Memory Dump Analyzer. In Intellitrace, we're able to take our historical debugging information and be able to use it to better understand and find our problems. So Steve, why don't you show us how Intellitrace works?
Thank you very much. I'd love to. If you jump to my screen, you're going to see the Parts Unlimited website. And this is a demo application. You can pull it off of GitHub. It's got a lot of wonderful things, both from a deployment standpoint and showing you how to use ASP.NET 4.5 or MVC 4.5 and MVC 5. Great tools. Love this website. And if you go out, I'm going to show you this Parts Unlimited website, and I'm just going to simply run the application. Now, when I run the application, it's going to, you'll see here, I've got the Parts Unlimited. I can go into breaks, and basically I'm buying some things. I can look at disk and pad combos, and I can add them to my cart, etc. That's basically what I'm trying to get through. Now, if I go back and leave everything up and running, if I'd run into some kind of problems or difficulties or performance, I can go right here and note all of the things that have happened. And there's a bunch of exceptions that come down here. And in fact, that's problematic. They're all caught, but they're thrown, caught, exception after exception after exception. And that usually is a smell. And I'm wondering, is the application breaking or not? So let me open up one of those exceptions. And by simply double-clicking the exception, it brings me right to the code that caused that problem. It's returning this get service. We've got an object, and it's resolving this service type. And if it can't, it looks like it's catching it and returning this base service, kind of the default service. And if I go up, I'll see that's the SignalR dependency resolver. So this is probably a dependency injection type framework, and something is going wrong there. Now, that helps me identify very rapidly where some of those problems are. But I can't step through my code currently. So let's dive into more details around what we get out of historical debugging with Intellitrace. It's not just a tool for looking at your execution and logging things that happen, and then maybe correlating it with code, although it does that well. It's a tool to debug historically. And what that means, I'll show you in a moment. But first, let's set up how we get it configured to do the ability to step through code in our application historically. So let's go over to the the tools again, and I'm going to drop into options. And in Intellitrace, I have it enabled. That means anytime I push F5, this is F5 Intellitrace debugging, it's going to capture these Intellitrace events. Very minimal effect on performance. You saw me push play. I was scooting through that website, something fast. Now over here, I can also collect call information. Now this will degrade. It has some negative impact on your performance. We don't leave it on all the time. There's some tools like Intellitrace in production, which dramatically minimize that impact. But right now, I'm looking at just the events and call information, and I want the whole shebang. I want everything here. I'm going to drop into the Advanced tab and look there for just a moment. I can store these Intellitrace recordings in a directory. What's powerful about this is I can have a log captured, and I can email it to someone. They can take and walk through that debugging step, even though they don't have it. So if it won't reproduce on their machine, at least they can see what happened on my machine. Now, where this is very, very powerful is if you use this with Team Foundation Server or Visual Studio Team Services, you can capture this data as part of running your normal testing practices. Manual tests, coded tests, doesn't matter. You can capture this detail and automatically capture it and attach it to a bug. Why do you care? Because now, if a tester runs into a problem, the developer can replicate it. And I've seen this used very widely in places where the testers might be running on machines that are closer to the performance profile of their user machines. So instead of having 32 gigs of RAM and 8 cores like your standard developer box, you're going to have 2 gigs of RAM. So we might have some different performance characteristics on the local box, the tester box. Tester can run through, find things that would be impossible to reproduce on the developer box, but the developer simply needs to open the bug and get this log, which will be automatically attached to that bug if the test was run in the context of the Microsoft Test Manager. That's powerful. So what I'm about to show you extends beyond just the developer experience and goes all the way through to the rest of your organization as well. And I think that's the important thing about Intellitrace and what makes it so powerful. Now, let's jump back in and take a look at what happens when I turn on that call information. So I'm not going to store the recordings in the directory. If I did, we could simply double-click them and open them. But I'm going to go and do one more thing here. I want to go to Intellitrace events. And these are the events we want to capture details about in addition to that call stack. We were capturing a lot of other things. I'm going to click File. So anytime any access to a file occurs, we're going to get a notification, access, close, or delete a file. We might go in and we could track threading. This is an ASP.NET application. I'm not going to track threading because threads are created and destroyed as people are coming in. But we might grab other details. XML. If I was going back to that very first example where we were doing XML processing and whatnot, I might care deeply about understanding what's happening with XML. These are all of the things that we have access to and we can capture details about in our Intellitrace logs. And lastly, there's modules. We don't have to collect data from everything. By default, we collect Intellitrace from everything that's running except for what's in this list. And if you look at this list, very difficult to understand, right? Public key, colon, and then a bunch of numbers and letters. These are basically all of the Microsoft products and the .NET framework. So you're not building up so much Intellitrace data about things where your bugs probably aren't, right? The chances of a bug being inside of the .NET framework are, I would argue, lower, at least for me, than they are in my code. So this limits it to my code. You can also, if you have a very large application, you can say, I want to capture data only from this module. And you can specify which modules, so only Intellitrace is captured for that small part of your application where the problem might be. That allows you to find out in there. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and then we're going to go back in, and we're going to rerun our application. I'm going to stop the application, and I'm going to rerun it again. It's going to take a while to build and deploy. Get rid of the old one. And as you can see, we've got the same application up in front of us. Little slower performance. Let me drop to lighting. You can see that it takes a little bit longer to get from stage to stage. I can go into the headlights and I can shop now for headlights and browse products just like I did before, but there is a perceptible slowdown. Not dramatic, but perceptible. But we have our application up and running. Now let's go back to Visual Studio and we can go and we can see this log again as before, and I can scroll up and like we can see we accessed this file. It was in the user cache area. You can see here we've got some area registration cache files, ADO.net. We can see exactly what queries were executed via ADO.net since we captured them. We had some XML work that was being done. All of these are very important and easy things for me to consume. And in any case, we can always double click and we can see that file, see that access. But I want to go back and show you those exceptions again, because I want to come back to those exceptions and open them up so we can see them in the code again. So here it is, this inner resolve code. But now I can switch over to my calls view, and let me open my Intellitrace settings again. I've got my Invector calls. Let me cancel. And one thing that I am going to need to do, I was debugging in the process when I made this change. I do need to stop my debugger, bring it back up into play again. Let me stop and recontinue. And that brings us right back into the demonstration. And we're back with the video being displayed. Once again, we can browse and whatnot, but I'm not going to go too far into the browsing this time. Instead, we're going back to Visual Studio. And now, when we break into Visual Studio, let me find an exception that was thrown again and open it back up. And this time we have call stack information. And I can look at the individual calls, I can see the variables, but I'm going over here and setting the debugging context right to this area. And this is what I find interesting. I now can step into and go to the next call or Intellitrace event, or go to live mode. We're in the historical mode, and you see it here with this little icon of a clock. And this allows me to step back in time, forward in time, etc. And so I can step what happened next. Now I want to stress that what I'm demonstrating here is historical data being pulled from a file that's currently being stored in memory, but a file nonetheless. And that file could be the same as a bug report that was sent to me. I could be stepping through that code instead. I don't need to actually execute the code, but I'm using it here in the F5 context. So I've stopped the debugger, or I've paused the application and stepped back in time to see what happened. I don't have to set debugging breakpoints to use Intellitrace. So I can step forward and see what happened. Move forward, we catch that resolution failure, and then we return this base get service. The data is stored in the local windows of what's available there. And now I can go in and understand what's going wrong with my application and why am I not able to resolve that Unity container dependency. And I can go into Unity and start looking there. But I've very rapidly identified a problem right in the application. That, in a nutshell, is Intellitrace. And Intellitrace is one of those things that I have seen make a giant difference in organizations. I've got to tell one story. I was at a customer site, and they had most of their development team on MSDN Professional at the time. And this was available in MSDN Ultimate only. And now it's available in Ultimate in Visual Studio Enterprise. But at the time, only their lead architect devs, kind of their core devs, had the ability to use Intellitrace. And what was interesting is all of the testers were gathering this Intellitrace data. And what would happen is the bugs would come in, and Rennie, who normally gets the bugs? The most senior developer, the architect, or the junior dev?
Oh, it's the junior dev.
The junior dev, right? The junior dev would get the bug, and they'd start to try to reproduce it, and they'd try to figure it out, and they couldn't often get it very quickly. They'd work on it for about an hour, hour and a half, depending on how patient they were. And if they couldn't figure it out, they would walk over to the senior dev, the architect style person, and they'd sit down and they'd open it up in Intellitrace and then generally solve it in a minute or 2 minutes. And what was so interesting at this organization was it happened often enough that while they were in the purchasing process to get more enterprise, or in that case, ultimate subscriptions down to the developers, what happened was the senior folks gave away their ultimate subscriptions, what would now be the enterprise subscriptions, to the junior folks because they saw so much value in the ability to grab those bugs that were captured and very rapidly identify the problems. That's where Intellitrace shines. And you don't just have to use it attached to bugs, and you don't just have to use it right here in F5. You can also use it in production. And for that, I'm going to you, Rennie.
That's right, Steve. We call this Intellitrace in production. So Intellitrace in production allows us to be able to do the exact same thing, gather historical debugging information, and then give us the ability to be able to look at the information after we pull it off the server. It's very easy to pull together. Very briefly, all you have to do is you take a file, you install it on your server where the website, the application is going to be, where it's going to reside in production. You're going to install that. You're going to configure some permissions on there, and there's a couple scripts that you need to put in place. You put that in, and now you have live debugging information without having to install Visual Studio on the production server. So again, it's very, very straightforward to be able to put on. There's some configurations that you need to do at the command line level, but that's Intellitrace in production. So you have Intellitrace for developers, and then in scenarios where you need to be able to debug a live application, you can put Intellitrace on the server itself and be able to get that information. All right, so that's Intellitrace.
I want to do one quick thing, because
sure.
I just thought of this. If you use System Center, if you have System Center locally, System Center has an integration that works with Intellitrace. So in System Center, if a bug comes in or a defect is found on some server, it allows you to simply go in and say, gather data on that server, click a button, and it automatically deploys everything necessary to start gathering that information. Once it's captured, you can stop it. It'll pull everything back off of that server and attach it to that incident that's filed in System Center. And then it can go right to a developer, and a developer can pull it from production. And I don't know why I didn't mention that as one of the core things first, but think of that. You've got attached to a bug, you've got F5, you've got Intellitrace in production, where if you own the server, developer, you can go in and put it up and gather that data. But if you don't, if you have System Center, you have full integration to automatically capture Intellitrace logs with the click of a button with System Center and attach them to those System Center issues, which can then be handled by you with Visual Studio Team Services or Team Foundation Server. So there's so many areas that Intellitrace can positively impact the developer's life. I think it's incredible. Sorry for the interruption,
no, it's
but
fine.
That's exciting stuff.
Yeah, it's just another example of a DevOps solution where development and operations working together. All right, in our next section, we're going to be talking about how to use CodeMap and integrating that with debugging. So we'll be talking about CodeMap, debugging, integration.
Welcome back to the Visual Studio Advanced Features Overview. Now, I'd like to talk about tests. So Rennie and I will discuss 4 major topics. First, Intellitest. Then we're going to be jumping into fakes and shims. Kind of those wrap out the unit testing piece. Then we're going to talk about other forms of testing that may traditionally fall onto your tester group, not the developers, although they should be working close together. And those are coded UI tests. And that's taking those tests that your developers, your testers have actually executed and run and turning those into automated tests so they don't have to manually drudge through those each and every time you have a build. And lastly, we're going to be talking about code coverage for manual testers. Now, many times, we just hand off the testing to a group of folks. They go in there doing a bunch of manual tests, but we don't really get a good idea of how much of our code was actually covered. So we'll talk about how to set up code coverage for manual tests at the end. I think those are one of the important things for people to do in their overall development lifecycle. So let's start off with Intellitest. And in Intellitest, we have a way to generate test data for a suite of unit tests. Basically, we can generate some inputs and some expected outputs from those tests. Rennie, are you ready for a demo?
Oh, I'd love to do a demo.
Fire away.
All right. So I'm going to bring up Visual Studio. So the point of Intellitrace is that we want to generate unit tests. And let's briefly just talk about the value of unit testing. One of the things that we want to start doing is we want to be able to start injecting quality into our code, or quality assurance into our code, earlier in the process. We don't want to just start writing our code right now and then start testing it as developers through our development process and then hand it back to a tester to start testing it. There's a lot of times where we're going to be giving what we believe is quality code to a tester, and then they go ahead and come back and say that's not quality at all. So with unit testing, we have a way of being able to validate the quality of our code ahead of time, and it's repeatable validation, right? It's actually coded tests. So we're going to actually show you how to create unit tests. And what we found is lots of dev groups sort of shy away from creating unit tests. They're hard to do right, or they're just hard to do. People don't know how to do them. And so Microsoft's done a great job of creating tools in Visual Studio to be able to start this process of creating unit tests. So let's take a look at how to do this. I've created I've brought up this WinCalc application, and obviously you can see how I can just add 3 + 3 = 6, and we can click these buttons. But what we want to do is we want to validate the logic that every time we do an addition, adding two numbers together, that it's always going to do the same thing. So we're going to create unit tests to make sure that anytime we do some type of refactoring of the code, that it doesn't break the logic. So we can do that fairly easily. First thing, I'm going to come in here to Math Basics here. Open this up, and I'm showing you the calc logic. We have an add method and a multiply method and a subtract method here. And I'm going to come to the add method, and I'm going to right-click on this. And within this contextual menu, we have create unit tests, we have create Intellitrace, run Intellitrace. I can go ahead and just generate a unit test from this. Just create unit test here. And click OK. And what this is going to do is it's going to generate a specific unit test that's going to validate the add method. So then I can come in here and take a look at what that looks like. Oh, it's right there. It's an add test, and it asserts as failed. So this doesn't do much other than run a test and then asserts that it's failing. It's actually not going to validate anything.
Which is important, right? If you're doing traditional test-driven development, you start with red, green, refactor, right? Rennie, you started from a signature. If you were going to do traditional development with test-driven development, you'd start with the test first, but it's always failing. You have that failing test, assert.fail, then flesh out the unit test so that it should pass if you write the right code. Write the code, get a green passing test, then refactor. That red-green refactor loop that you get into, this constant building up of your unit tests. Unfortunately, we've been talking a lot about legacy code, and like you mentioned, Rennie, a lot of code isn't covered. I think it's table stakes today that if you're a developer, you know how to write unit tests, and you do write unit tests. But you're still going to run into legacy code that's not tested. And one way to do it is to start and manually create each of those by generating a unit test. That gets old. Rennie, back to you for Intellitrace.
Thanks, Steve. So now what we're going to do is, let's take a look at creating a unit test itself by using Intellitrace. I'm going to right-click on Add, and I'm going to do Create Intellitrace. I'll click OK here. Now that it's generated this, let's take a look at what this particular test will look like. Now you'll notice that unlike our previous test that we created, which is just an assert failure, Intellitrace goes ahead and it looks at your method, and then it creates a way to actually test by handing off values to it. So we can actually test the actual method, actually create an actual test that validates that method, and then if those values that are passed in there are correct, and it actually adds together, then it'll be successful for you. So we're actually going to run this just to show you how it works. I haven't really put any values on here, but we can come in here, and I'm going to come in here. I'm going to just right click on Add again, and I choose Run Intellatest. And now what it's going to do is it's going to execute this particular unit test I've created, run against this add method, and it should come back as successful, even though right now it's just going to add 0 plus 0. What we can do, though, after it's run, is we can come through and we can pass it multiple values. Well, this is an add thing, so really there's not really a lot of edge cases, a lot of things that we can do. I suppose we could try and see what happens when we threw in an A plus 1, but this calculator doesn't actually accept it. So this is a very simple example. But we could actually inject a whole lot of different values to sort of run it through its paces. And that's sort of the power of creating unit tests using Intellitrace. It simplifies the process. Again, in summary, when you just generate a unit test, you're going to have a very simple assert failure. This will fail every time we run it by the way it's designed until we put in logic. But you can now have the ability to actually have it automatically put in logic for you to run the method through its paces. And
that, I think, is one of the more potent things with Intellitrace is it doesn't just run one. You just did the example, the very simple one where it's 0 plus 0. You can specify to run a range of numbers, to go in and add negative numbers, positive numbers. And again, the key for any unit test demo is start with something really simple. Add is canonical, but there's a lot of complexity involved in real-world unit testing. And those are the cases where you might be putting in strings and integers and testing all sorts of different variations, but you can automatically generate those so you can run a whole suite with something like Intellitrace. Now, Intellitrace is critical. Very nice feature for just generating some of those tests. But I mentioned unit testing is difficult, and sometimes you have things that you need to fake out, create proxies for, or in shims, where you're actually not calling all the way out, but you've got a fake or a shim in place to stop a call from going out to something like system.datetime would be an example, so that you can feed it back consistent information. So let me give you an example. You may, when this is talking fakes and shims, probably ought to go to the slide first, just so people can take a quick look at fakes and shims. In the case here, we've got a stock feed that's coming out, this stock feed, and we don't actually want to call out to the stock feed, right? We don't want to make that call. It's going to take a long time. We can't do that as part of our unit tests. We want to just fake it out, right? We just want to pretend like we're calling out there, because a unit test is meant to test isolated code. It's testing just that one method. We're not reaching out and testing whether the stock price works, whether the internet is available, all of that stuff. We're just testing our logic for this small thing. We have a dependency reaching outside of it. So with a fake and a shim, what you're trying to do is indirect, stop that from going all the way out, and get you a response that's predictable. Again, the canonical example for a fake, you can wrap up any calls to system.datetime.now to always return a particular value. That way you can write your unit test. You may have a lot of logic based on a date, but you can't just accept any dates in there and then get a particular output. The output is based on the date that comes in. So you want to be able to test for a particular date. I'll age myself here, but back in Y2K, right, we wanted to make sure it was still 1999, but we wanted to drop in a test where the date was passed in past 1999, just January 1st, 2000. So we put those in. If we would have had something like a fake, we would have been able to fake out all those calls to the current date time from system.datetime. That's what fakes do. They allow you to set up and intercept those calls that are going into the framework or going somewhere else, and then return values back that you specify. And that's the power of fakes really in this framework. Unit testing, definitely, like I mentioned, table stakes for developers. If you're a developer, you should be writing unit tests on a regular basis. If you're coming into legacy code, things like Intellitrace can really help, and things like fakes can help build out your unit tests when you haven't been able to architect them to be well testable with interfaces. So that's quickly a wrap on unit testing from a testing perspective. Next, we'll jump into looking from the more formal tester perspective with coded UIs, taking manual tests, coding them up, as well as getting code coverage so we can see how well or how effectively our manual tests are covering our code. Welcome to the Advanced Features overview, and right now we are jumping into performance and tuning. I'm Steven Borg.
I'm Rennie Ructo.
And let's talk about two areas where we can optimize your website. First, in running what's called a web performance test. Then we're going to group those together and run a load test leveraging those same web performance tests. First, web performance tests. Web performance tests are basically a request, response, and an analysis. So you basically just make a request, get a response. Unlike the testing stuff we talked about before, where you're spinning up the application and clicking through the application as part of the test, this just makes very lightweight calls and looks at the responses. So it's all running without a UI. So you can't test things like, is the color right, or something like that, using these types of tests. Instead, they're built for performance. So, demonstration. Let's see these performance tests in action.
Excellent. All right, so in order to do a web test, and let's just quickly summarize, what we're doing is we're going to create a recording of our actions as we move into, as we actually go into our website. So I'm going to pull up a website. I'm going to give you an example of what we're doing. So this website here is our Fabricam Fiber, sort of a fake site really, but you can use any one, any site you can target. We can record. So we're going to go into the site and I'm going to be clicking through this. What we want to do is we want to identify different use case scenarios, like different use cases, for different users. So for example, maybe you have a user that wants to go in and create, in this particular case, create a ticket. In another case, maybe it's an administrator going into that site and doing administration. Or maybe you're a customer service rep and you're coming in and you're looking at notes for a specific account. These are different use cases, and we want to record how a specific user is going to interact for that particular use case. And then ultimately, we'll take those various use cases and we will combine them into a single load test. But right now, we're going to just do the recording, the web performance test, or web performance recording. Now to do that, it's pretty straightforward and easy. I'm going to go into Visual Studio. I'm going to go to File, New Project, and in here, I'm going to create a web performance load test, and that's found underneath the test section of Visual Studio, or sorry, Visual C# here. I'm going to click OK. And it's going to bring me up the web test recorder. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to click this record button, and then it's going to take me to IE, and I can start interacting with a particular website. And then in a few minutes, we'll talk about some of these other options. So let's do that. Let's just click Add Recording here. Notice that now it brings up a new session of Internet Explorer in this particular case, and it's starting to record. I'm going to click on this link. This takes me to my application, my Fabricam Fiber. Now, I'm right now at this dashboard, and I'm going to click on a particular ticket here, and then I'm going to edit this. Maybe one of the scenarios is I'm editing it, and I'm going to add in some more notes, and we'll just say the problem is fine now, period. Right, now that I've done that, I'm going to save it, and then I'm going to come back out to my dashboard. I'm going to click a couple other times. Maybe I'll click Create New, because that's one of the scenarios, and I'll say Power Outage again. And then from there, I'm going to just say that there's been an outage. Oh no. Frowny face. So we come in here and we'll click Create, and we get an error. Well, this is something that does happen when we go to websites. Sometimes we get errors, and we're going to click stop here, stopping the recording. Now, as we stop the recording,
it only requires you to have happy faces in those. You can't have a frowny face.
It's the unit test that actually identified it. So we've now captured what happened as we went to the website, and then we clicked around, and we captured all those different steps. Now, most of the time, you're not going to necessarily get an error, hopefully, and it doesn't really matter for this particular example. But we have captured all of these different steps. Now what I want to do is I'm going to run this test. The reason why I'm going to run it is I want to see if it can successfully rerun all the steps I've just taken. I'm going to click on here. And you'll notice that this last step created an error, and it actually failed on me. It created a service error. So this is actually okay. In this particular case, I run this test. It gave me an error when I was actually recording it. I've rerun it, and it gave me that error, and you'll notice that it failed. That's not a problem, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to delete this last step, right? Because that error, I don't want to actually, that's not part of my use case, part of my solution. So I'm just going to come in here, I'm going to delete this step, boom. And now let's rerun this. Let's see what happens when we rerun this particular web test. Excellent. Now you'll notice that the test is still running here. That's because it's just wrapping up and finalizing all of the different test result details. But you'll notice in this middle screen here that it actually brought up the website I went to, and it ran and it did everything that I had already done. It actually hit every one of these points. It did some edits. It updated something, and it tells me on this particular part of the screen, it tells me the total time it took to do it, what the request time is, how much data is being passed right here, and there's total response bytes. So we can get some information from this web performance test, and this allows us to see how the performance actually is from an automation perspective. Now, when we go back to this test, there's a few other things you should be aware of. What I've just done is a fairly straightforward and simple thing. You know, I've basically created a record in my application. Now, when you're running this test, you're probably not going to want to create a new record that looks the same as every time. Maybe you want to have, you create one record that says power outage, and then you want to create another record that says something else. Maybe there's 3 different records that you want to create. In that particular case, you would come in here and you could actually add a data source, where then you could have it pull from a database or from some type of data source, maybe a CSV file or an XML file, and it's going to grab that data, and then it's going to go ahead and it's going to add it in at the right point in time as you're doing these edits. There's ways for you to be able to automate that, if you will, or not automate, but actually grab various data sets and then insert them in here. Another example there is, let's say you're wanting to run a web test with, let's say, different users. So you have an administrator logging on, and then that logs off, and then you want to try a regular user logging on, what that looks like, because maybe the interface changes for each one of those different types of users, and you want to sort of see how long it takes when the administration panel comes up versus when a user's control panel comes up. So just a couple different examples of doing that. So there you go. That's my web test. Now, web tests are pretty straightforward, as you can see. They're pretty straightforward to create. And what I would do is I would create multiple web tests for different scenarios. In this one, I've created a ticket. But maybe there's another scenario where I want to do a lookup. And I could very easily come in here and create another one. In fact, let's just do that very quickly here. I'm going to click add. Come in here, and we're going to do add. And we're going to create a load test, another load test. Oh, sorry, not load, the web performance test. We're going to be doing a load test in a moment here. Add a web performance test, thank you. And we're going to do this again. We're going to come in here and go to my home page. And now we want to maybe look up a customer. And I'm going to click on customer here. All right, now the customer page comes up. And I'm just going to quickly look at the details of Maria Cameron, and I can see these details. And I'm going to stop this because this is one example of a different use case. So now we have 2 different web tests. Now, after we've clicked on that, it's going to take a second or two as we detect the dynamic parameters. And depending on how much interaction you have had with that website, this might take longer. Okay, so now that it's not detected any dynamic parameters, we have two different web tests. This is great because I have two different scenarios. From here, I'm going to actually create load tests. I'm going to pass this over to Steve, and Steve's going to talk about load testing.
Thanks, Rennie. That was a great introduction on web testing. Before we jump to load testing, let's take a quick break.
Hi, welcome back. Our last phase is the release phase. This is where we are getting our application that we spend a lot of time developing, debugging, tuning, testing. Now we're going to get it into release. And we're going to talk about release management, a great, fantastic tool that you get with Visual Studio Enterprise. Release management gives you the ability to be able to define a pipeline, getting your application out the door. So there are 4 different stages to a release pipeline. One of the stages is our approval stage. This is a really important stage. This is the stage where you are authorizing and making a statement that this application is ready to go prime time, ready to go into production. Or maybe it's ready to go into test. Maybe it's ready to go into pre-prod. But it's an approval phase. It's a space where somebody who actually knows how to make this determination would approve and move this into that particular stage of your release cycle. There's also the testing phase. The testing phase is where you're going to be testing your application, whether it be manual tests or automated tests. It doesn't really matter. There's a testing stage to this pipeline. There's also the configuration of the application and the installation of the application into an environment. That's a very important stage where you're configuring SQL Server, let's say. And then finally, there is the infrastructure configuration stage. This is where you're actually making sure the environments themselves are well configured and ready to accept into your environment. Now, there's a couple things to note about a release pipeline. One of them is not all projects require a complex pipeline, and not all software release pipelines need to be complex. That's a very important point. Now, when you're looking at a Visual Studio release management pipeline, there are 5 different practices you should be thinking about. One of them is release planning, and this is where we're just going to define what that release looks like. Take some time to look at that pipeline, define how, what, when, and where it will be released. Then you have the release definition itself, which defines what that release pipeline and the workflow should look like. You should also get very familiar with creating your environment. You're going to need to manage, provision, configure your environment. And then there's the actual deployment automation, which is where you're taking the application and then deploying it into those environments and automating that process. And then finally, you need to have a way to track the status. One of the advantages of having a formalized release pipeline is that you have logs, you have alerts, you have approvals, ways for you to be able to stay in touch with the actual release from a formalized perspective. So let's actually go in and take a look at what release management can do for us, how we can configure it, and what a pipeline can look for us. Steve?
Thank you very much, Rennie, and we're off. This is one of my favorite topics of all time because it's this delivery pipeline that can make or break a development team. If you can't get your application into your dev, into your staging, and frankly, into your production environments in a timely fashion, you can't get the feedback that you need to rock your development. You just can't get stuff done quickly enough. This is the major blocker that we see when we're helping companies move faster. They get blocked. They can't get even into their dev environments without extreme difficulty. And we need to be able to get all the way to production easily. So I'm going to make a couple assumptions here before we get started. And the first one is that you have an automated build. And frankly, that automated build should be running those unit tests that we talked about earlier. It should be running those integration tests and those coded UI tests as well. That, I think, is frankly very, very important. Let's leave the coded UI tests because we can drop those in after the release as well.
Oh.
So we'll talk about that.
Excellent.
Let's go to the screen, and I want to show you the environments that I have. Now, I'm here at partsunlimited-dev parts.azurewebsites.net. I've got another area, which is Parts Unlimited MVA Demo -staging. And I've got my last one, which is my production build. Now you can see my production build is completely unfilled at this point in time. But I do have stuff out in dev, and I have stuff out in my staging environments. So one of these things that I want to stress is we have to have multiple different environments that we're going to be pushing to and through. So let's go into Visual Studio Team Services. And I'm up here in Visual Studio Team Services in a Parts Unlimited project. Now I want to stress as well that if you're going to get into automated pipeline delivery, especially at the infrastructure level all the way up, I would highly recommend you go get the Parts Unlimited project. It's out on GitHub, it's available, and you pull it down and it comes with a whole group of hands-on labs to help you get through and really leverage this continuous delivery pipeline. Great. It's an excellent tool. So I'm in Parts Unlimited, and again, I'm going to assume I have a build, and I'm going over to this Release tab. Now, it can take a while to build out a good release pipeline. So I've got one that's already come out of the oven and one ready to go into the oven, if you would. Let's take a look at the one right out of the oven to start with. I'm going to open up, it's called Parts Unlimited here, and I want to edit this definition. And you can see we've got 3 environments, dev, staging, and production. And in dev, we've got this Azure Resource Group Deployment and Azure Web Deployment. And the Azure Web Deployment does the deployment. But Rennie, you mentioned something up front that I thought was really important. Infrastructure is core. We need to be able to configure and deploy our infrastructure. You may hear it called infrastructure as code. And right here in this first step where we're doing the Azure Resource Group Deployment, we're taking and defining exactly what our infrastructure should look like and pushing it and creating it in Azure. Now, you could create this locally as well. It doesn't have to be in Azure, but boy, it's easy when it goes to Azure. And so here, in this first step, it reaches out and creates everything necessary in Azure if it's not already there. Now, if it's already there, it doesn't worry about it. And then the next one, this Azure Web Deployment, is where we actually are doing the deployment piece. Now, when we deploy to staging and then on to production, these are areas that are further on stages of the pipeline, and we're going to build these out. I'm going back to the demo build. And in the demo build, this is where we're going to start. I'm going to click Edit, and we have just the dev task here. And I can actually, on this one, if we want to start all the way from scratch from dev, let's do that. I got rid of staging even. So here we are at dev, and it's the same dev as that we had before, but now we're going to add a new environment. Now, the key here is these environments are dev, staging, prod, whatever it is that we've defined. You may have dev, QA, pre-prod, performance testing. You may have as many of these as you need. We're going to stick with kind of those core 3. So I'm going to add a new environment. This handles my deployment to dev. I'm going to add a new environment now, which will handle my deployment out to the staging area. I'm going to start with an empty definition. You don't have to start with an empty definition, but I find it useful because I can show you some of the other things that are available. And we've got a staging area built. I'm going to add tasks. And under the tasks, there's a lot of things that we can do. Under deployment, we could run some Azure PowerShell, do an Azure file copy. We could run Chef, Docker. There's things for Docker, IIS web deployment. And we can do machine groups. There's a lot of different things that we can do just in the deploy stage. I'm going to go up to the test stage, and under test, there's a lot of other things we can do here. This test agent deployment, that'll help deploy those tests agents so we can do those large number of tests. Here we can do cloud-based web performance tests and load tests. Those are things that you brought up earlier.
What I'm looking for.
And we can just slide those things in. But let's go to deployment and start with an Azure Web Deployment. And I'm simply going to click Add here and close this. Now, we have to specify a few things. The first is the Azure subscription. Now, already associated with Parts Unlimited is my Parts Unlimited Azure subscription. This is just my subscription. We need a web app name. You can click the down arrow here, but there's nothing yet defined. So I'm going to put in, I'm going to put in here, the website name, and maybe just website. That's the website that we're going to be hitting. Where are we going to deploy it? And I'm going to deploy this to West US. I kind of want it to be right next to my other applications. And which slot? This is an Azure specific feature, but a website can have multiple different slots. I'm going to drop it into the staging slot that we saw above. And for the web deploy package, I'm simply going to look at my Parts Unlimited build, and in my drop folder, I already have my drop location, which gives me basically the deployed package. Like I said, we're already assuming you have an automated build process in place. So that's where I'm grabbing that zip file. It's got everything I need, no additional arguments, and we're good to go. That's pretty much it for that first part. So I'm going to save this one. There might be a couple more things we might want. We may want to run some performance tests, like I mentioned before. Very easy to add. You simply click Add Tasks, and then add the various things that you need to run. We're not going to do that for this demonstration. We're going to keep it simple. But I'm going to open up staging, and we can do a few more things here in staging. One of those things is security. We can specify who has authority to trigger this or edit this. We can configure variables. We might have some variables that we want to put in here. There's a little lock key. If you drop in a variable, you can click this. It'll keep it secret. It'll encrypt it for you. So a lot of things we can do there. And most important for us, for this particular case, is assign approvers. Yeah. You mentioned that was critical. Yep. Right at the top. We hear about all these really crazy web ops companies that go to production 20 times a day. Every commit goes all the way through into production with no human intervention. That may work very well for a lot of companies, but not all of them. Some want or need human intervention to approve a push to production. It could be for regulatory compliance. It could be for a number of reasons. Let's stick with having some of these approvers. We have two approvers on this one. Automated means it just gets approved. If this gets triggered, the staging build gets triggered, it'll automatically go in. I can go in instead, and I could say, Rennie, I want you to be an approver on this. Now, so that you don't have to spin anything up, let me go back and let me put myself in and as the approver. And also, I'm going to put myself in as the post-deployment approver. Now, in these cases, there's two. One simply says, I want to approve before you push into this environment. One says, after you've pushed into this environment, and before we sign off on it being good, I want a human to look at it. And I'm going to click Send Email Notifications. That lets people know that something has occurred, and it lets me know it's deployed, and then I can click a button inside the email. So I'll click OK there. And I think I'm about ready to go, except we're only in staging, and we need to go to production. Let me do one next thing. I'm going to clone this environment. Having to recreate environments can be a pain. So I'm going to just clone this one and call it production. And in the production one, let's open it up, and let's look at our approvers again. And on this one, we're not going to do a post-deployment. We'll just automate the post-deployment approval. Once we've decided to go to production, we don't need to check it. But I want to approve it before it goes. Right. So I'll go ahead and do that and click OK. And now we're ready to go potentially to production, except it's still deploying to the staging slot. Get rid of that. The final slot with no name is generally your production one, and we're ready to go. Let's save it. Now, I have this set up for continuous integration. So if I go back to this dev environment and I look at the approvers, you'll see it's automated. And I have it being triggered off of a check-in. So I can check in, and it'll push all the way through the system. Okay. Yep. Now, I already, however, have a build that I can deploy. So I want to spin up this resource group, if it's not already there, and then do the deployment. And to do that, I'm going to create a new release. Now, there's two things here. There's a draft release that you can create. Very useful if you want to just say, what would this look like? Tell me what all the variables are and that sort of a thing. Or create a release, and that will actually build it out for us. By the way, there's a few other areas here. I should mention places like artifacts. That's where we define what artifacts we have, and we're going to grab the Parts Unlimited build, do some custom configuration, website name here being the Parts Unlimited variable, and triggers as well, continuous deployment if you want to trigger a new release when a new artifact version. And if we did that, that would do that continuous delivery piece. Now, I want to come back, make sure we're good here. We're staging. That's got website. I want to do one quick look before we deploy to make sure that I have that correct. And it is website name. Glad we didn't go. I'm going back to my demo. And let's make sure that that's website name in my staging area. Thought that seemed wrong, and when we went and looked at the variables, sure enough it was. Website name is it. Save it, and let's create a release. Create the release, we can give it a description, we tell it what build we want to take with it, and what target environment. We're going to go all the way up to production with this environment. Let's create that release. And it has been queued. We can go and take a look and see the release as it goes. One area we might want to look at to see things progressing is we can move over and look at the logs section. And then we can see what's actually happening as it's deploying. So as you can see, through the magic of time acceleration, we've gone through and completed the build. If I go down here, you'll see that we followed all the deploy steps, deployed the artifacts, created and updated the existing deployment, and then deployed it to the website name. We got post-deployment approval, because that was just a standard one, and we're ready for staging. Notice it says a pre-deployment approval is pending for the staging environment. I can go ahead and approve or reject this, and we can now start on the staging process. I might say, looks great, even though I didn't look at it.
And this could also show up via email too if you had somebody on the list, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It would email me. In fact, I think I set it up for email, but I'm just going to approve it right from here. But that could be done directly through the email as well. Simply brings you to this approval process. I'll click approve. And the release has been approved, and now it's queued and waiting to start. This is similarly to the dev environment. It's going to move out and then deploy it to the staging environment. One thing I do want to do is I want to go back and look at our staging environments as they exist today. And if we go back over and look at our Parts Unlimited page, we can see here, old and new, find the parts for you. Just a moment. I'm waiting for it to scroll a little bit longer. We've got our discount, all of that area. In our dev area, then we go to our staging area. It's still working. We're now deploying to the staging area. And then the Azure website production is not yet deployed to. So we're deploying right here now and not to the rest. So let's go ahead and head back to Visual Studio, back to our build. And we're still requesting that build from the agent pool. And we're back. A post-deployment approval is pending. I can then jump out, look at it to decide whether I want to approve or disapprove it. Rather than go through that process, I'm simply going to approve it, which brings us on to our next. We have a pre-deployment approval is pending for production. I know it seems a little redundant that I have all these approvals going. Normally, they don't run this fast. You have testers that go in and look at the thing and then say, okay, we're ready to go. But I'm going to approve this push into production, and I'll say ready for prod, approve it, and we're off and running. Our release has been queued and ready to start, and now we're going to be deploying for the first time to our production environment. At this point, it looks like we've gone all the way to production. The post-deployment approval, remember, that was an automated step. If I go back and look at my summary for this release, you'll see in dev, staging, and production, it succeeded, as well as how long it took to get into each of those areas. I can see the build that it came from, all those other good pieces of information. But, drum roll, here we go into the actual website itself. And let's refresh this page. And boom, Parts Unlimited has now been deployed all the way through from our dev, staging, and production environments. That's that power of that automated delivery and that automated build and release pipeline. I've got to say, I'm absolutely blown away by the capabilities and the power available inside of Visual Studio Team Services and inside of TFS that allows you to so easily build and deploy so simply a relatively complicated app. Again, Parts Unlimited is not a trivial app. It's a fairly complex app. And yet, you can build that continuous delivery pipeline with ease. There's no longer an excuse. You need to have a continuous delivery pipeline enabled in your organization so that you can go to production when you have to and when basically your testers demand it and your stakeholders demand it. Build that pipeline out. We showed you a very simple pipeline, very easy to build, no excuse not to build it, but I want you to add a couple more things. Make sure you get those tests in there. Rennie, you covered those really well. We need to have not just the infrastructure, not just the deployment of the application. We need those tests and that approval phase.
Yep.
And I showed you how easy it is to plug all those together.
Right.
And Rennie, that's a wrap.
Yeah, so we've gone through a lot of great things, a lot of great features in Visual Studio Enterprise. We've talked to how these different features can apply from soup to nuts, from your design all the way to your release of your software. So what should you do next? Well, it's time to download Visual Studio Enterprise Trial. You just go ahead and go onto the website. You can actually just Bing it. Search for Visual Studio Enterprise Trial, and you'll be taken right to the right place. So go give it a try too.
Absolutely. And until next time, farewell.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the 38th episode of Microsoft RF Code, brought to you by Millionlights. As you know, we are going to begin with Python and Flask. We have Suzanne and Christopher Harrison from Microsoft, who is going to show us how to create web pages. We will go through the foundation of Flask and Python, explore user input and data storage, and learn to create and retrieve Redis data. We'll see some demos from the basic Hello World intro. Some of you must be thinking what stuff you can do with Python and Flask. Well, you can pretty much automate a lot of stuff like schedule your computer to do certain tasks. If you know Flask Python framework, then you can build a complete clone of any web app you think of. As we always say that these courses are not only beneficial for students, but also for working professionals. So, if you have these skills, you can be software engineer, software developer, data scientist, etc. and earn from 5 to 10 lakhs. Before we start the session, be sure to download these tools for free. Visual Studio Community and Python tools for Visual Studio to get the most out of the course. In this part of the series, we will cover Introduction to Flask, in which we will learn how to get started and why one would use Flask to create websites, a walk through the standard Hello World demonstration, and close with a prime on HTML. So let's get started.
All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where it is in the world that you happen to be joining us from.
Guten Tag and Buona Cena. And I was trying to learn hello or good evening in Italian, but I think Buona Sera, I think is right.
And Susan is speaking in tongues.
Yeah.
It's a great way to start. In any event, thank you for joining our little jump start here. This is an introduction to creating websites using Python and Flask. This is a Web Wednesday, which, by the way, I'd be remiss if I didn't go ahead and plug the next handful of Web Wednesdays that are coming up. You'll notice them on the break slide. We got a lot of cool stuff, Azure websites. I'm going to be in here doing Angular and MVC with Entity Framework. So a lot of really cool stuff. You'll see all that on the break slides. But what do you say we introduce ourselves and introduce the course and get rolling? Because we got a little bit to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Getting everyone rolling.
Yeah, why don't you talk about yourself?
So my name is Susan Ibach. My Twitter handle is Hockey Geek Girl, and my job is I'm a technical evangelist at Microsoft. And what that means is I help developers understand how to get started with our different tools and technologies. A lot of stuff with Visual Studio these days. I am also a Microsoft certified trainer, and the first program I ever wrote was on a computer with 64K of memory. So I'm not going to admit to how long I've been coding, but that might give you a hint.
Yes, that's a little bit of a giveaway.
Absolutely. I've worked with a lot of different programming languages, and I think one of the most important things to realize is, as you play with all these different programming languages, is that, you learn one language as a starting point, and that can take you so many different places.
Yeah.
The principles we're going to see today in Python, someday you're going to explore another programming language for web, and you're going to see similarities to what we see here today.
Yeah, absolutely. In any event, I guess I should introduce myself.
I think so.
I am Christopher Harrison. I'm a content developer here at Microsoft, focused mostly on ASP.NET, although that's now expanding into an ever-broadening range of web technologies. And Office 365. I was an MCT for 15 years. I guess I still am, but not a full-time MCT like I was. And I got started with a Commodore 64. And I actually wrote a blog post on this in a couple of weeks ago, where I talked about the fact that the first main program that I punched in, it was from a copy of an old magazine called Byte, and it was a clone of a popular game. And instead of being able to just type out print, you had to put in the question mark, because otherwise you would run out of memory.
Yes.
So quite a little while. And beyond that, you can find me out spending time with my wonderful wife, four-legged child, and running more miles than most people would consider normal, I think.
Yeah. Good on you.
So you do the same, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and hit our agenda for the day. So what we're going to start with is actually an introduction to both Flask as well as HTML. So if you haven't played around with Flask, not exactly sure why we chose Flask, what this is all about, we're going to get into that in Module 1. And then we'll also discuss a little bit of HTML. I am going to say right away, though, that if you're trying to use this to learn HTML, this is really not the best spot, but we'll talk about some resources where you can go get that.
Right, because Flask is what's going to allow, is one of the ways you can take Python onto the web.
Exactly.
So that's where the connection between the Python and Flask comes in.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's actually other alternatives that you could use as well. There's Bottle, there's Django. We went with Flask. We'll actually talk about why we went with Flask in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
And then from there, we'll go ahead and actually take a look at getting in and creating web pages. And that's going to be our terminology warning section, because that's really where we're going to get into how those requests are going to be mapped and how we're going to control what code is going to get executed behind the scenes. And then all of that is really kind of the appetizer to the main event, the first of two main events, which is going to be Module 3, where we'll actually build the structure of our little trivia app that we're going to be using for our demos. And that's going to be the front end. So that's going to be the ability to ask the questions and answer them later on, add questions and answer them later on. But what we're going to see is we're going to want somewhere to actually store those, and that will roll us right on into Modules 4 and 5 being the second main event.
Right, where I'm going to go into the back end of things, because one of the things we're going to see as we get into the websites is the fact that when you're building web applications, you have to think about what is the user seeing and how do we communicate with the user, as well as when they give us information, how do we store that information and how do we retrieve information on a server side. So I'm going to be talking about the Redis aspect and different ways that you can store data so that you can remember what's happening between calls.
Absolutely. And then finally, last but not least, we'll have done all this work here locally. Wouldn't it be nice to share this with all of our wonderful viewers and our friends?
Well, exactly, because by default, if I sit here on my computer building a website and I'm running my website and testing my website, it's only available on my machine.
You know, I noticed a common phrase throughout all of it. You kept saying website, website, website. I'm thinking we should probably get that onto the, wait, it'll come to me. We should get that onto the web.
Aha, yes.
Hey.
So exactly. So so of course we're going to finish off with saying, hey, hey, now that we've built something cool, how do we share that and put it out there onto the great world of the internet, onto the web, so others can see it?
Absolutely. And that's where we'll close everything off, is actually taking that, putting that out there, and you'll actually be able to see all of our work. And if you've been following along at home, you'll even actually be able to get in and deploy that out as well. Fantastic. Now that we've talked a little bit about us and what we're going to talk about, let's talk about you. And let's kind of set where it is that we're aiming this. And what we're looking for is really, new Python developers that are looking to take that next step. So if you checked out our Introduction to Programming with Python, which is a 2-day event, lots of great content, and you may even get a toaster.
That's right.
Yeah, you'll have to check that out to find that out. But if you followed along with that, this is really designed to be the next step from there. And then also burgeoning web developers. So if you're just kind of trying to check things out. But I would also mention that if you've done web forms, if you've done MVC, and you're really just trying to see how things are in other environments.
Yeah, because you do hear a lot about Python these days.
Yeah.
So, yeah, maybe you've been developing in .NET for web, and you're curious to just explore Python web development.
Yep.
This will be a reasonable course to take you down that path as well. You may be familiar with some of the concepts, because as we mentioned earlier, concepts tend to be the same from language to language, but we will show you things like the routing and so on for Flask and Python and that sort of architecture.
Absolutely, and I would say, kind of going back to a point that you had made earlier about programming languages having a lot of similar concepts, is that if you've already done C# or VB, a lot of what we're going to be seeing in Python is going to be relatively similar to what you've seen before, and so you'd probably be able to still follow along just fine, even if you haven't necessarily done Python. So if you've done another programming language, you can definitely check that out.
All right.
Or check this out. Last little thing is, of course, you can go off and get your 50 points. I still, I say this every single time. I do need to update that because it's actually now 2.5 million registered users.
Fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's your little voucher code. And I would also mention that it's on the FAQ page as well,
yes,
which is where you're also going to find our slides. Now, before we launch into Module 1, I do need to mention one last thing. And this is actually brand new. This is the first live MVA jumpstart that's going to have closed captioning. Right now it's closed captioning for English, but we do have closed captioning that you should notice on the video stream, and I'm not sure which side of the stream
I'm seeing comments about the closed caption, so it must be coming up.
There's a button like right about there somewhere. I think it's either on this side or it's on that side. I don't know which side of the stream I actually end up on.
We don't see the closed caption.
Yeah, we don't see us. But in any event, you will notice there's a little spot right down there that will say captions, and then you can turn that on or turn that off and actually see live closed captioning, which again, this is the first MVA jumpstart doing that, which I think is
cool.
Is pretty slick. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Okay.
That's all in this episode of this course. I hope this tutorial was helpful. In the next episode, we will continue with the same course, beginning website with Python and Flask, and cover the remaining topics. Is your mind ringing with questions, queries, or doubts? Do you wish to learn more? Then visit our website www.millionlights.org and post your questions on our forum. We will be really happy to clear all your doubts. If you missed anything and want to rewatch it, you can download it from our website or can watch online as well. You can also participate in our webinars, discussions with the subject experts, as well as get Microsoft certification on various courses through our website. You can also find us on Facebook by the name Millionlights and also on Twitter. For more such interesting tutorials on coding, keep watching Microsoft Hour of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Thank you.